Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 218, Reconstruction, Part 1. So, by now, we have concluded the narrative of the war itself. With this episode, we're officially going to begin Season 2, or Phase 2, whichever one you want to call it. And it's going to be introducing also our new schedule here. And I think there is a key place that we can start here as a kind of continuation of our postscript of the narrative episodes, in that we can start to talk about Reconstruction and spend 2 episodes really delving into those events. Of course, before we talk about Reconstruction here, we do need to talk about our Patreon content, and we did another movie review for this last month, be Major Dundee, having a couple of key actors, Charlton Heston and Richard Harris being the top 2 actors there, and it does actually, I think, tie pretty nicely into kind of the conclusion of the war, right? We had our last skirmish of the war there at Palmetto Ranch in Texas, and this is going to be, relatively in the southwest corner of the United States. It's going to be going into Mexico, going into the French involvement in Mexico. So I think it's actually a pretty good place to have this particular movie review. And obviously, you could classify it a little bit more as a Western than anything, but there are some pretty key themes that are relevant to the Civil War. Obviously, it has Union and Confederate soldiers in there. So, obviously, once again, I think it's about as good a time as any to have it. So, if you think that sounds like it would interest you, there we have other movie reviews posted on the Patreon, memoir reviews, picture slideshows, among other pieces of content. And, one of the things that I may not have mentioned in our announcement recently about kind of this Season 2 and the new structure of how we're going to be doing things moving forward. We're going to be continuing to roll out some Patreon content. Hopefully hit that every single month moving forward. That's not going to change. So we're going to keep trying to come up with things to do for the Patreon. So that is not going away either. So support does go toward the general upkeep of the show. It's always greatly appreciated. To begin with, I think Reconstruction is really something that we can continue to have episodes on. I've mentioned this with several other parts of the war, especially the beginning of the war, where you could probably have a series of itself talking just about Reconstruction, talking just about the causes of the war, right? So having 2 episodes might seem like we're kind of rushing through it a little bit, but I do think that it is worthwhile, at least, to go over these events, because they really are the foundation of how the United States operates in the early 1900s. It's really setting it up to kind of continue on this path moving forward, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next episode. We talk about Reconstruction, but to begin with here today, I think we need to dial back to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had showed generosity to the southern states as the war heavily turned to the favor of the North. State governments were reestablished, and the high-profile Confederates were considered to be small potatoes for the president. If they fled the country, so much the better. But Lincoln was now dead, and so things were going to be different. Andrew Johnson would be president, and really, he might not have been the best choice. Johnson has been in our story before. He's been the pro-Union governor of Tennessee. And when Lincoln was seeking re-election, he was going to need an individual who was going to get him additional support for some of the southern states, or some of the individuals who are going to be more moderate, who otherwise maybe would have leaned to the Democratic ticket. So somebody like Andrew Johnson seemed to be a good choice. Johnson had been born in North Carolina before moving to Tennessee. Once there, he had served as a senator prior to being the governor, and during the war military governor of Tennessee. Remember, he had been pulling at Don Carlos' mule to leave behind a force as Bragg marched in Kentucky. He was a heavy drinker who probably was not apprised to the plan that Lincoln had in mind. You see, radical Republicans still wanted vengeance. One only has to see Stanton as an example of that. But as Johnson was from Tennessee, he would also be sympathetic to the Southern people. He had as many as 13 enslaved individuals as late as 1863. He would not be heavy-handed, so in some ways, he would be perhaps someone that shared the mold of Abraham Lincoln, at least to a degree. Lincoln had run on the national unity ticket in his re-election bid, so he was not in bed with Republicans any longer, which is sort of the reason where you get some conspiracy theories of how his assassination was a coordinated effort by those who had once supported him. But with Johnson now in the ultimate seat of power, the question still remained, what are we going to do now? That's kind of something that we didn't talk about in the main narrative episodes, is that Lincoln does have this break between himself and the Republican Party. Obviously, it's not going to hamper him in terms of his re-election bid. George B. McClellan is still going to be the primary opponent for him. There were some whispers of that, hey, we need to come up with a different candidate other than Abraham Lincoln, because he's not really in bed with what you would consider to be a radical abolitionist any longer. He wants there to be a reunification of the United States, and if you're going to be operating with a heavy hand, as some of these individuals probably would have wanted, then it might not be as easy to reunify. And that's one of the reasons why you have somebody like Johnson, who's going to be the vice president, because we can bring in some votes from the South if we're not going to have the full backing of the Republicans. It would have been just as easy. You probably would have actually maybe even said to yourself, oh, there was somebody else who would have been an abolitionist, perhaps, that we could have had as a vice president if you're getting rid of Hannibal Hamlin, which you are. But obviously, again, this is how things shake out. Let's first look at what Lincoln's plans had been prior to his assassination. Fortunately, we have a blueprint of exactly what these states would start to look like, and the occupation of many, and the establishing of legitimate local governments back into the Union. Remember that the primary goal of the Union is to bring the southern states back into the fold. You recall probably the 10% plan that would allow for southern states to get back into the Union. Lincoln had shown this to be successful with such states as Louisiana. Especially as the war progressed, there was an ever-steady turn of moderates in the South to be pro-Union once again. This would be Abraham Lincoln's breaking with the radical Republicans, many of whom would wish to permanently disbar any Confederates from being a part of the Union, most especially part of government. Lincoln had generally held the policy of providing amnesty, so this would be a major shift. It's one of the big things that you have to like about Abraham Lincoln as well, is that, during his time, he passes out a whole bunch of pardons, especially for individuals who are in the military, even in the Union military, who are being accused of crimes that probably would have carried with them a death sentence. Lincoln is going to be constantly writing stays of execution for them. Under the Wade-Davis bill, Congress would present the harsh measures on the South while also giving the formerly enslaved the right to vote. Anyone who participated in a government would need to take an oath that they had not only never served in the Confederacy, but also never supported it either. Now, as you can imagine, you would probably find it hard to find individuals who could swear to both of those things, and certainly they were probably no longer popular in many of the states that they had once resided in. To the north, the South were traitors who had sparked the rebellion in general. It was logical to limit their rights once they returned. Also remember that the radical Republicans were a smaller minority in the North. Lincoln disagreed with them on this point. He would pocket veto the bill, keeping the 10% plan alive. The goal, once again, had been to reestablish the legitimate government, reestablish the Union, the Republic, and so it would make sense to keep going as they were going. Keep the Republic in order, as there was a real split in exactly what was the correct thinking of whether states had voluntary membership and whether they could, in effect, opt out. Remember, we talked about this briefly in our causes of the war and also our recap on the war itself. Lincoln would write a letter regarding the proclamation of amnesty and reconstructions. And we have that letter here to give us a better idea of what he was thinking. You were so kind to say this morning that you desire to return to Louisiana and to be guided by my wishes, to some extent, and the part you may take in bringing that state to resume her rightful relation to the general government. My wishes are, in general, expressed as well as I can express them, and in the proclamation issued on the 8th of the present month, and in that part of the annual message which relates to that proclamation, it there appears that I deem that sustaining of the Emancipation Proclamation, where it applies, as indispensable, and I adhere that I would esteem it fortunate if the people of Louisiana should themselves place the remainder of the state upon the same footing, and then, if in their discretion it should appear best, make some temporary provision for the whole of the freed people, substantially as suggested in the last proclamation. I have not put forth the plan in that proclamation as a pro-Christian bed to which exact conformity is to be indispensable, and in Louisiana particularly, I wish that labor already done, which varies from that plan in no important particular way, may not be thrown away. The strongest wish I have, not already publicly expressed, is that in Louisiana and elsewhere, all sincere Union men, with stoutly eschew cliquism, and each yielding something in minor matters, all work together. Nothing is likely to be so baleful in the great work before us as stepping aside of the main object to consider who will get the offices if a small matter shall go thus, and who else will get them if it shall go otherwise. It is a time now for real patriots to rise above all of this. As to the particulars of what I may think best to be done in any state, I have publicly stated certain points which I have thought indispensable to the reestablishment and maintenance of the national authority, and I go no further, and this is because I wish to avoid both the substance and appearance of dictation. Abraham Lincoln. So there you go. We need to make sure, if you're willing to go back in the Union, we all got to work together. We all got to be patriots. That's one of the things that I think both sides can agree on. They do have this very strong sense of country, and that goes all the way back to the Revolution. So we're kind of drawing off that. Be back into the fold and be a good member of the United States. Let's move forward with these governments. Lincoln's going to write again in 1864. My dear sir, you asked me to put in writing the substance of what I verbally said the other day, in your presence, to Governor Bramlett and Senator Dixon. It was as follows. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not think so and feel. And yet, I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. It was in the oath that I took that I would, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I could not take the office without taking the oath. Nor was it in my view that I might take an oath to get power and break the oath in using the power. I understood, too, that in ordinary civil administration, this oath even forbade me to practically indulge my primary abstract judgment on the moral question of slavery. I have publicly declared this many times and in many ways, and I aver that, to this day, I have done no official act in mere deference to my primary abstract judgment on the moral question of slavery. I did understand, however, that my oath to preserve the Constitution, to the best of my ability, imposed upon me the duty of preserving by every indispensable means that government, that nation, of which that Constitution was the organic law. Was it possible to lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution? By general law, life and limb must be protected, yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life, but a life is never wisely given to save a limb. I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful, by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. Right or wrong, I assume ground, and now avow it. I could not feel that, to the best of my ability, I'd even tried to preserve the Constitution if, to save slavery or any minor matter, I should permit the wreck of government, country, and Constitution altogether. When early in the war General Fremont attempted military emancipation, I forbade it, because I did not think in an indispensable necessity. When a little later, General Cameron, the Secretary of War, suggested the arming of blacks, I objected because I did not yet think it an indispensable necessity. When still later, General Hunter attempted military emancipation, I again forbade it because I did not think it yet the indispensable necessity had come. When in March and May and July 1862, I made earnest and successive appeals to the border states to favor compensated emancipation, I believed that the indispensable necessity for military emancipation and army of the blacks would come unless averted by that measure. They declined the proposition, and I was, in my best judgment, driven to the alternative of either surrendering the Union. They declined the proposition, and I was, in my best judgment, driven to the alternative of either surrendering the Union and with it the Constitution, or of laying a strong hand upon the colored element. I chose the latter. In choosing it, I hoped for greater gain than loss, but of this I was not entirely confident. More than a year of trial now shows no loss by it in our foreign relations, none in our home popular sentiment, none in our white military force, no loss by it anyhow or anywhere. On the contrary, it shows a gain of quite 130,000 soldiers, seamen, and laborers. These are palpable facts, about which as facts there can be no cavailing. We have the men, and we could not have had them without the measure. And now let any Union man who complains of the measure test himself by writing down in one line that he is for subduing the rebellion by force of arms, and in the next that he is for taking these 130,000 men from the Union side and placing them where they would be for the measure he condemns. If he cannot face this case so stated, it is because he cannot face the truth. I add a word which was not in the verbal conversation. In telling this tale, I attempt no compliment to my own sagacity. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. Now the end of 3 years' struggle and the nation's condition is not what either party or any man devised or expected. God alone can claim it. Whether it is tending seems plain. If God now wills the removal of a great wrong, and wills also that we of the North, as well as you of the South, shall pay fairly to our complicity in that wrong, impartial history will find therein new cause to attest and reverse the justice and goodness of God. Yours truly, Abraham Lincoln. So there we go. We have a good letter from Lincoln here. It gives us a really good idea of what his thought process was. And we've mentioned this a couple different times in our main narrative episodes, so it should come as no surprise in that Lincoln is an individual who's going to make sure to try to exhaust every opportunity, every option, and he is able to very articulately explain his thought process in trying to make sure that he keeps the country together. He's facing a really tough task, really a task that there probably wasn't really anything he could have done or said once he was elected to actually change the way things were going to go. But he gives a pretty good idea of what his thought process was as the war progresses. We talked about Fremont, we talked about Hunter, how they're kind of jumping the gun on emancipation and thinking they, honestly know a little bit more than the president on such things. And we know that they're both coming from, Fremont at least has the military background. He is pretty stalwart in his republicanism. He's one of the founding members of the Republican Party. And then you have David Hunter, who's a huge abolitionist, and both of them are going to try to jump the gun. They're trying to have some emancipation before it's ready. And Lincoln is going to say, hey, it wasn't at the time, we didn't have to have it. It was something that was certainly on the table. It's something that personally he thought was right, that was just, but really he was pushed into it. He comes to this conclusion that it's absolutely necessary, and he moves forward. So that gives us a really good idea, once again, of what Lincoln's thought process was. And finally here, we're actually going to have a proclamation as part of the pocket veto from Abraham Lincoln. So we have 3 straight Abraham Lincoln quotes here. Whereas at the late session, Congress passed a bill to guarantee to certain states whose governments have been usurped or overthrown a republican form of government, a copy of which is hereto annexed. And whereas the said bill was presented to the President of the United States for his approval less than 1 hour before the adjournment of said session, it was not signed by him. And whereas the said bill contains, among other things, a plan for restoring the states in a rebellion to their proper practical relation in the Union, which plan expresses the sense of Congress upon that subject, and which plan it is now thought fit to lay before the people for their consideration. Now, therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, do proclaim that, while I am, as I was in December last, when by proclamation I was propounded a plan for restoration, unprepared by a formal approval of this bill to be inflexibly committed to any single plan of restoration, and while I am also unprepared to declare that the free state constitutions of governments already adopted and installed in Arkansas and Louisiana shall be set aside and held for naught, thereby repelling and discouraging the loyal citizens who have set up the same as to their further effort, or to declare a constitutional competency in Congress to abolish slavery in states, by at the same time sincerely hoping and expecting that a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery throughout the nation may be adopted. Nevertheless, I am truly satisfied with the system for restoration contained in the bill, as one very proper plan for the loyal people of any state choosing to adopt it, and that I am, and at all times shall be, prepared to give executive aid and assistance to any such people, as soon as the military resistance to the United States shall have been suppressed in any such state, and the people thereof shall have sufficiently turned to their obedience to the Constitution and the laws of the United States, in which cases military governors will be appointed, with directions to proceed according to the bill. So there you go. You have a pretty good idea of what Lincoln is trying to do here, what he's trying to do, and what he's trying to adopt post-Civil War, which I think is important to keep in mind as we get further into Reconstruction. So we have an idea of how we're going to continue to try to plan and provide aid. We have a little mention of military governors that we might have to go ahead and deploy those if necessary. And these are some things that we are going to talk about here moving forward. The first is that there was the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established to provide this aid. Military governors are going to take the helm to ensure there is a proper transition. But with Lincoln gone, we had Andrew Johnson. He would try to expedite the process of Reconstruction, which really, perhaps it was not going to be such an easy endeavor. This is where we see the choice of Johnson as vice president to be somewhat confusing. At first, he seemed committed to a harsher penalty on the South, even arresting some governors, and there were some whisperings of executions. Remember, we had Jefferson Davis, who is going to be apprehended, and there certainly is talk of having him put on trial and then, ultimately, most likely executed for treason. But also remember that he was a Democrat. Everything that the Republicans were doing would be against the grain, not limited to their reliance on paper money and the equal rights of African Americans. Confederates would be pardoned. Jefferson Davis was eventually released from his imprisonment in Fort Monroe as part of Johnson trying to extend the olive branch. Andrew Johnson was really the wrong guy at the wrong time, and while it's debatable whether Lincoln would have been very much different in the overall approach to combating the Republicans, it cannot be said that he would not have probably done a better job. You can certainly make the argument that Lincoln had had this split with the Republican Party. He wasn't seeing eye to eye with them any longer. However, I think you can also point to the two individuals. We can kind of compare the two presidents here and what their thoughts are. You could certainly look at Abraham Lincoln and say, well, he had this kind of split from the Republican Party. He was probably still more aligned to the things that they thought, right? He was still more aligned with them than with the Democrats. So while he's not getting along with them while he's president, he certainly could have found some common ground with them. There could have been some kind of negotiation. I think also we should point out, too, that there is this kind of fast track to making sure that Reconstruction happens, to making sure the South is put back on its feet. And certainly Johnson is a big proponent of that because he is from the South and he does have these Southern ties and he is a Democrat. So you might not have seen such a, kind of light speed journey by Abraham Lincoln. It's going to take time. You can't just go ahead and fight this war and have so many people die and so many lives just ruined, whether it's on the home front, right? The ravages of war happening, all throughout the South, and in some cases, even some northern states as well. So you really cannot rush things, right? You can't just go ahead and say, all right, well, the war is over, but here's your seat back in Congress, and you have the same voting rights, and we're going to be putting on the table even maybe some amendments that we just passed here that we really want to have move forward. So there is that kind of difference, I think, in Lincoln. Whereas, Johnson, again, Democrat, they're going to be trying to work together there in the beginning, and they're just going to be bumping heads. They're just going to be rubbing each other the wrong way. And this goes back to the fact that, again, most of these radical Republicans are from the North. Most of them are going to be pretty hardcore abolitionists, and they're just going to have different thought processes than Andrew Johnson. So while, again, in the beginning, it's like, hey, let's go ahead and work together. Let's go ahead and roll forward. As time progresses, then that relationship is going to deteriorate, and then you're going to see Johnson doing pretty much everything that he can do to try to sort of derail the agenda set forth by these Republicans. As we get into Johnson being in charge of this effort for Reconstruction, I think notably we can probably say that Abraham Lincoln would not have simply allowed Southern governments to ignore the amendments to the Constitution. Southern states would adopt black codes during this time, notably in 1866, which, as you are right to assume, by the year there is very shortly after the conclusion of the war. They're going to be designed to combat the new measures in support of black people. They would continue to operate as second class, having no voting rights, no citizenship, and not being able to serve on juries, as well as not being able to own firearms. Overall, this is not much better than before. Sharecropping would give at least limited freedom. However, it was the richer planting class which still owned the means of production and still dictated the growing of cash crops. Johnson had given many of the confiscated land back, again keeping the status quo. Violence would soon spark in places like Memphis and New Orleans, with actions directed at African Americans across the South. To eliminate the black codes, the response of Congress would be the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but President Johnson would attempt to veto this, and at first be successful, although the veto was overridden on a second pass. Now, this act was important because it was designed to integrate African Americans into the fold of the Union. Already there had been freedom, yes, but citizenship was something that many continued to argue against. Voting, likewise, was a contested subject. The act would define American citizenship, including rights, and forbid the restriction of the rights based on color, or race, or prior condition of slavery, or involuntary servitude. Now you could sort of see that Johnson was trying to fast-track and placate the southern states and their re-entrance to the Union. He would be opposed to the Republican efforts of Reconstruction, as we already mentioned. Talks of impeachment would arise early. He would bump heads with Stanton, eventually removing him from being Secretary of War. Famously, Stanton is actually going to kind of give Johnson the finger, so to speak, and he's going to make it super difficult for his removal. Eventually, he will be removed, though, and there's always this kind of backlash, and we talked about it a little bit with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the fact that Stanton really doesn't want to relinquish power. It's more or less because he doesn't like Johnson. He is in the kind of camp of the radical Republicans here, of course. Doesn't like Johnson. He doesn't want to make it easy for him, but there are some who point fingers at him trying to hang on to his seat of power as evidence that he had somehow been involved or orchestrated the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, again, we have talked about that before and how that's kind of a fanciful sort of conspiracy theory, but still gives some credence to that nonetheless, the fact that he's not willing necessarily to give up power, and actually really he tries to sort of act as the president for a while in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, which again raises some eyebrows. Overall, the question is going to come down to this: who is going to be enacting the policies that are going to guide Reconstruction? In a war setting, it had been the president, right? During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is going to have an immense amount of power as the president. And that you might sort of have missed that throughout the narrative. You might have kind of downplayed that a little bit. But Abraham Lincoln is in such a unique situation when the Civil War is being waged. Not only is it, of course, the only civil war in this nation, right? You could sort of count the American Revolution kind of as a civil war, I guess. But you don't have it certainly on the scale of this semi-modern war that the American Civil War becomes. But Lincoln is just going to kind of be able to do whatever he wants. And that's one of the things that makes it unique. Now, the president was supposed to be guiding the effort, but now that we have peace, the question is going to be, whose responsibility is it? The war is over. So now, is it going to be the executive branch? Is it going to continue to be Johnson? And that's going to be part of the problem. It's going to lead to Johnson's impeachment for his attempts to derail the Reconstruction efforts, and we're going to actually shift toward Congress calling the shots. And that is something that we are going to cover in next time's episode. So we've begun Reconstruction. We are going to have part 2 in Reconstruction and kind of round everything out, but I think it was important to kind of set this baseline, talk about Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and really the ultimate argument, I think, as well, in that who is going to be leading this effort. I really can't state that enough, in that it's really a question of, is it going to be Congress? It probably should be Congress in a peacetime setting versus the president, who's going to be trying to dictate how things are going to be moving forward in terms of Reconstruction. So we've done a good job of setting that baseline here today, I think. And then next week we will get into when Congress actually starts to take over, and that's going to lead us into the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. If you like what you hear, please make sure you leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.